I'm Paul Teske. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs. Delighted that you're here. I want to recognize our Provost, Constancio Nakuma, is with us tonight. So thank you for coming with his daughter also. And so we're delighted that you're here, and lots of other important, interesting people in the audience. So thank you for being here. I think it'll be a great panel. Tonight, as you know, we're focusing on the ballot initiatives and the process. As you also know, probably there's something like 14 at the state level, and that's with the property tax ones taken off. And there's maybe 11 in Denver. So I live in Denver, so I think there's 25 things to vote on in addition to people. I grew up in New York, and we voted on people, but not things. And so it's there's half the states, I think 24, 25. Have the initiative process, though Colorado's is easier than many. And so that's why we have so many things to vote on, which we're going to talk about tonight, but also the process. And I think also what it means for democracy. Is this a good way to handle public policy? Is it a really bad one? And I think we'll have some different perspectives on that. Just logistically, please grab food in the back. The bathrooms are around the corner. If you have to leave early, we understand. But if you can stay longer, we'll end about 7 o'clock, plus or minus, and we don't get kicked out at that point. If you want to continue the conversation and or get home, whatever it may be, that's all good. We had some things running earlier about the panel and some of the issues. We usually do a land acknowledgement here at University of Colorado, Denver, that we're on the ancestral homeland of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes, among others, and we certainly honor and appreciate that. It's also Hispanic Heritage Month, and this campus was built, as many of you may know, as an urban renewal project on what was a working class Hispanic neighborhood. And many of the pros and cons of that, but the honoring and appreciating of that 50 years later. So with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will introduce our esteemed panel. And Seth made it. Thank you for persisting. Look forward to hearing about the event today as well, probably. But Floyd Ciruli is with us. He moderated our panel back in September. Floyd is renowned as a pollster, political strategist, political analyst in Colorado, currently lives in California, but is back here a lot to keep up with the Colorado scene and has a national picture, and really excited to have him back to talk to this all-star rock star panel about our issues for tonight. One other thing, there are 3x5 cards. If you want to write down some questions, we'll collect those and bring those up and ask as many as we can. We usually don't get through them all. And I'll also just remind myself, we have maybe 25 people that signed up to be online watching this. And so we do everything by mics, partly for them, but also we're happy to have them on board. So thanks for being here. Floyd, please join me in welcoming Floyd Ciruli.
Thank you, Paul. I've given about 2 or 3 speeches, even this week, just on politics and the election. And by and large, people are more interested in talking about the ballot initiatives than they are the presidency or the congressional seats or legislative seats. To some extent, you have sort of a small opportunity to change the presidency, but you feel very close to these ballot issues. They're ours, and you can turn on CNN and sort of get the what is currently going on in the presidency. But we're hoping this panel and a lot of the local media is providing us the information we need for these ballot decisions. As the dean referred to, referenced, we're one of the states that has direct democracy, and people like it. I do polling, and they tell pollsters that they understand that there are things that the legislature just doesn't do, and that it's nice to be able to get around them sometimes and have a solution. And they like them because they often sign the initiatives. They also, however, are concerned about the number of them, the volume of them, and the complexity of them. And I think also listening to people in dialogues like we're having tonight, some are concerned about, well, what was the origin of that? What does it do? Where does all the money come from? Those kinds of questions are also factors that I think people are interested in. And given, as was pointed out, we have 14 initiatives, or not just initiatives, but proposals on the ballot. Some were referred by the legislature, and many were initiatives, which is I don't know if it's a record number, but it's a high number. And they range from everything from animal rights to guns to abortion to criminal justice, school choice, election rules. And it's just sort of amazing. Denver, I think Denver has, I was saying that it had 12, but it certainly has 11. And it has a lot of tax initiatives, labor union initiatives, has a couple of bans on things. So it also has some very interesting and kind of difficult ballot initiatives for people to take a look at. Let me mention the format of the panel for just a second. Each of the panelists will present 3 to 5 minutes of just initial thoughts, what their thoughts are about this process, about any particular initiative they're interested in, a little background, whatever they want to do for that period of time. Then I will, they will, after that, I will start with 1 or 2 moderator questions, and then those cards that you're filling out will be the next round of questions. And they can obviously ask each other questions if they want, and really have a dialogue. When I ask a couple of my questions, I will try and get a response from each panelist that certainly wants to respond to it. So that will be sort of how we start. Let's start with Krista Kafer, who is a columnist for the Denver Post. She has opined on propositions. She has some interesting thoughts about the role of the legislature and people thinking about that, and sort of categorizing some of the initiatives, which I thought was sort of unique. Krista.
Opine, I do.
Yeah.
So this is if you've read my columns, and if you see me on Colorado Inside Out on Channel 12 Friday evenings, once or twice a month, you know that I am not a fan of the initiative process. In fact, I might be in that 2% that say I hate this, and here's why. We have legislatures for a reason, and I've worked in both the State House and Congress. I'm not a fan of politicians. I don't think that they're any better than regular people. In fact, in some ways, I think they're kind of worse, right, Seth? All right. He was just at a certain rally. But here's the thing: there are systems in place that require people to look at costs and at benefits. They have to get together with stakeholders. They go through hearings, then they go through committee markup. Both houses must agree, and it has to be signed by the governor. And of course, at the federal level, that would be going through Congress and then signed by the president. These are systems that require compromise and the looking at costs and benefits. If you just ask a regular person, hey, would you like a brand new program, something awesome, like maybe a light rail that nobody rides? People are going to say, yes, I would love that. Then you would turn around and ask that same group of people, hey, would you like a tax break? They're going to say, yes, I would like that too. Legislatures are not perfect, but at least they would not make the error, because they have to balance the budget, of passing both a tax break as well as a brand new program. In fact, I'm actually one of those rare Republicans that doesn't even like Tabor, which is why, having admitted that publicly, I will never be able to run for office. But I will say this: human beings, we are both good and bad. We are flawed. We need systems that help us rise and listen to our better angels. Congress isn't perfect, not by a long shot. State House is not perfect by a long shot. City councils, a little bit perfect, maybe? All right, a little bit perfect, but at least there are processes that require, again, looking at costs and benefits. And then there are also ways to protect minority populations that you simply don't see in direct democracy. There is a business right now and 180 employees that just sent out postcards to voters begging people to keep their jobs. Should the minority have to beg the majority to keep their jobs. Talking about the Slaughterhouse Initiative. But all of these initiatives, in one way or another, are about people going around systems to get what they want. And the one with the most money that can print the slickest brochures are often the ones that win. That is not fair. We need to take a second look at our initiative process and return to representative government.
Strong opinion there. And off to a good start. Kevin, why don't we go next to you, the representative, city councilman, Kevin Flynn. He represents the District 2 of the southwest side of town, was a Rocky Mountain News reporter. And Friday of election week, there will be a motion picture in the film festival on a book that he wrote. It's called The Order, and it's about a true crime here in Denver. And congratulations, Kevin. But give us your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you for the plug also. It's at the Ellie Calkins Opera House. It's about the neo-Nazi gang that assassinated Alan Berg in Denver here in 1984. If you were here then, you remember that crime. The legislature this last session took up just under 800 bills. So 100 people, with the help of staff, 100 people considered almost 800 items. On Denver City Council, we average probably about 1,400 items every year, and there are 13 of us. And so I respect immensely what Krista had to say about people who that's their job, is to go over the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons. I have never had a vote yes or no that was always 100% yes or 100% no. Well, actually I did have one that was 100% no. But usually you have to weigh the pros and the cons. To ask, how many voters do we have in Colorado?
Registered?
Yeah.
3.9 million. Active? Yeah.
So we're asking 3.9 million people to weigh in on 14 statewide ballot issues, most of which they will see for the first time, either in their blue book or in the ballot box, or when they get their ballot in the mail. And I don't know how most people on average gauge their vote, but I lived in New Jersey. I moved out here 43 years ago. In New Jersey, my wife and we would vote on those old Iron Maidens, the big matrix of, and you had the levers, click, 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 and an X would appear in the box. You had the curtain behind you, and when you pulled that lever, it went kerchunk, and you could feel your vote counting. And my wife told me that she usually would vote by making a pretty pattern with the X's. So that's not the way we should be legislating. I've told people in my district many times where we've had to struggle with citizen initiatives here in Denver that are absolutely unimplementable, if that's a word. Like a couple of years ago, there was the Green Roofs Initiative, which squeaked past. We had to completely rewrite that because it could not be implemented the way it was written. So what I would tell people in my district and citywide is that we vote on slogans, but we have to implement details. And when Krista was mentioning, you have to look at what's the cost of this and what do we give up by doing this, and we can't do that. On the Denver ballot, Floyd and folks, there are 12 items. You'll see 11 of them unless you live in the downtown area. In the downtown area, there's a tax increment financing district that we're looking to extend. So only the property owners and the residents in that area will have that 12th item on their ballot. That's a $550 million carryover of the TIF district that renovated Union Station and Market Street Station. We have on the local ballot, of those 11, 10 of them we put on the ballot. 10 of them. 2 of them are sales tax increases, both of which I voted no to put on the ballot. The others range from allowing collective bargaining for all city employees who don't currently have collective bargaining, all the way up to can non-citizens be police and firefighters in Denver? Can we accept their applications? How can we expect people to knowledgeably make a decision on these 14 and these 12 or 11 items in Denver with the little time that we've given you to do it? I really fear for the work we're going to have to do. One of the groups behind the citizen initiative on the slaughterhouse ban also put on a ban on selling, manufacturing, trading fur or other animal products, which is going to be a significant obstacle to our indigenous community, which relies on these items in their religious practices. And when this was pointed out to the proponents, they said at a forum, it was the Denver Democratic Central Committee, which I'm a member, the proponents said, well, city council can fix it later. Well, we can't, because the charter says we can't amend a citizen initiative for at least 6 months after it passes. And in that time, you're going to have the March powwow. So if it passes, it's going to be a significant obstacle for the March powwow. Also for the National Western. A number of the vendors at the National Western who make felt hats are going to be impacted by it. Well, city council can fix it. We can't fix everything. So I believe in direct democracy, though. Maybe to your chagrin, Krista. It originated in part here in Colorado in the progressive era, back about 110 years ago. Referendum, initiative, and recall. And so I value that. And I think the people value that. And we should hold on to it. But I think it could use some reforming. And I've probably gone over my 5 minutes, but just one last thing. There have been some folks on city council and elsewhere who think it's too easy to get something on the Denver ballot. It requires only 2% of the active voter roll to get on the ballot. And it's under 9,000 votes. And Ken Theory can get 9,000 votes on his lunch hour by paying people to do it. So one of the reforms I'd like to see us take up would be truly citizen initiative, prohibit paid circulators. Have circulators be only people who actually live in the community that will be deciding this. The slaughterhouse ban was put on the ballot by a group from the East Coast who hired people to come here. They're staying in Airbnbs while they're working and campaigning. They're not from here. So there is some reform we could look at that would make it easier, but I think what we really need to do is have more robust public education so that when you vote on whether our city employees can unionize or whether non-citizens can apply to be a Denver police officer, you'll know the pros and cons adequately. Thank you.
Very good. The chief economist for the Legislative Council, Greg Batinsky, am I close on that? Butsky, works for the legislature, both houses, and it also has a lot of responsibility for the Blue Book. He, as a chief economist, I heard him earlier talking about that very important financial report that comes out in the legislature, a revenue report that the legislature follows, and the governor and the administration has to follow pretty closely. So, Greg, take it away.
Absolutely. So I think a little bit of a different role for me relative to the other panelists that are before you this evening. I'm a nonpartisan staff person. I'm a registered unaffiliated voter. You won't hear me tonight speak in support or opposition to any of the measures that are on this year's ballot. But I do come from a unique perspective in the sense that I'm there at the very beginning of the process. The first thing that a citizen who wants to change the Colorado Constitution or our state laws has to do is submit the draft of their proposal to my office for review and comment. This is in lieu of the legislative process where you would hear a lot of technical negotiating and review of a ballot measure occur. It's brought before me, it's brought before an attorney or one of my peers and an attorney from the legislative staff. And we go line by line, word by word through the initiative and say, how do you expect this to be implemented? How do you expect this to be interpreted by courts? Often the goal is, and I think we'll talk about two measures that are constitutional amendments that create rights that were put on the ballot this year. One, a right to abortion, one, a right to school choice. They're broad, they're vague. They don't specify exactly what a right to abortion is or what a right to school choice is. A lot of what we put on the record in those meetings is exactly what the proponents expect and intend for those measures to accomplish when they become law, if they become law. So I hear what Councilman Flynn is saying about implementability. The measures that we see have, in some cases, expert level drafting, and in many cases are gobbledygook. They're not able to be read and responded to. But that's our role as staff, is to help proponents of ballot measures get their work into good shape. And then, as Floyd mentioned, later on, our responsibility is to make sure that voters are educated on what exactly it is that they're being asked to decide upon. The Blue Book production is a multi-month process. It starts back in April and May, and we wrap it up at the beginning of September when we send it to our industrial printer. We print nearly 3 million copies of it to mail to households across the state. It's an extremely widely published document. It's something that we take very seriously. We, of course, release public drafts of every one of our analyses 3 times over the course of the summer for public review and feedback. We get a lot of contributions from the community in terms of reviewing what's there. I've heard a lot of apprehension about the initiative process or about the scope of the ballot. So I just wanted to put a couple things in perspective that may be helpful for all of you. There are 14 measures on the statewide ballot in Colorado this year. That's not really all that many more than in some prior years. 2018, for example, had 13 measures, so 14 were up 1 over the last 6 years. Of those measures, 5 are constitutional amendments referred by the legislature. These are things that the legislature endorses. These aren't citizen initiatives. And they're things that the legislature is constitutionally not empowered to change without voter approval because they're constitutional content. Whether they ought to be constitutional content in the first place, I think is a matter that we should be discussing. But voters, I think by and large, wouldn't respond well to a measure that says, just take everything out of the Constitution and trust the legislature to handle it. 2 more measures are referred statutory measures from the legislature. Those measures cannot be passed without voter approval due to the Tabor voter approval requirements. So those are things the legislature cannot put in statute on its own because Tabor requires voter approval for those 2 measures. So that's 7 of the 14. The other 7 are citizen initiatives. 2 of those, like I said, are attempting to guarantee constitutional rights for things that are already legal in Colorado, abortion and school choice. And 5 more are statutory initiatives that are coming to the ballot because they would not pass the legislature. In all 5 of those cases, it's clear that the politics in the building are such that they wouldn't become law. You can say, well, these are elected legislators who are choosing not to support these matters because they don't believe that they suit the interests of the state. I'll just point out one salient example that may resonate with some of you. Back in 2012, voters in Colorado legalized the recreational use of marijuana with 57% of the vote at the ballot. Prior to the passage of Amendment 64, only 2 out of 100 state legislators said publicly that they supported it. So I think that there is a history in Colorado of cases where voters are willing to take actions that the legislature isn't. And the initiative process is a way for voters to be empowered to make decisions when the will of the voting population may be different than politicians in the building. There's one measure, the ranked choice voting measure, that I'm sure will come up tonight, where the measure has a pretty strong effect on political parties. And of course, every member who serves at the Capitol is a legislator who was affiliated with one of the political parties, whereas a plurality of Coloradans are not. So lots more to discuss. Thanks, Floyd, for letting me introduce myself, and glad to be on the panel tonight.
No, good opening. Our final presenter will be Seth Klayman. You might have seen his front page article today on Trump coming. A lot of good background coming to Aurora, and I guess he was probably out there getting ready for a story that we'll all read tomorrow. Seth.
Hi, hello, I'm Seth. I'm sorry I'm late. Yes, I was in Aurora at the rally and then had to quickly eat my first meal of the day and then take my dog out. So forgive me for being late. Normally I'm not this stressed down, but again, it's been a long day. So I cover politics for the Denver Post. So I travel in the same biome as Greg. I'm in the Capitol 6 months out of the year. When that's not happening, when I'm not covering bills and legislation, I'm a political reporter. So I'm right now covering a lot of elections, all the ballot measures, obviously. And I do a lot of work on housing, I guess, just as a quick bit of background about me. So I'll be really brief because Greg said everything I was going to say in a much better way. The main point being, of course, I'm a reporter, so I also am going to shy away from taking some sort of firm position one way or the other on any of these bills or the citizen initiative versus legislative process. I think the thing that I think about when I think about the citizen initiative process versus the legislature is Proposition HH. I remember Prop HH. So Prop HH, Greg is not, it failed the ballot box last year. For people who don't remember, it was the property tax bill, right? And its failure led to the special session last November, right? So if you talk to people in the legislature who work in politics, they will say Prop HH was a great piece of legislation. It was not a good piece of ballot language because it was very complicated. And there's a lot of people have a lot of thoughts about why HH died. I think a uniform belief is that it was complicated and that makes it harder. So to the point that folks were making about when you're in the legislature, you can have these much more artfully sort of crafted pieces of legislation, right? A lot of hands have been involved, people like Greg, lobbyists, lots of people, right, touch these bills. Some go through quickly, but often the big ones don't, right? Whereas the citizens initiative process is not like that, right? It just isn't. So that's what I think about a lot is legislation that is written by people who write laws and therefore know how to make them sort of work together, and how that does not always translate to people understanding, digesting, and supporting them, right? HH being a great example. I have a lot of, how to say this? I think the citizens initiative process makes sense. It's an important thing. But again, to my prior point, legislation is hard. It's messy, takes a long time, often, and a lot of negotiations, et cetera. And laws are complicated, policies are complicated. And I think there is a great value to having experts. Some legislators are experts, but there's experts working around them if they're not in working that process. Hopefully that was as mealy-mouthed as I could possibly be. I'll just retweet everything Greg said because that sounded great.
Very good. Please fill out those cards if some questions have already come to mind from the opening presentations. I've, as mentioned, spent a lot of time in California, and at the district attorney, who is a liberal reform district attorney in Los Angeles, is losing 2-1 to a Republican. That is sort of unheard of in Los Angeles, and it's because law and order is sort of back. People are very, very concerned about it. And as you know, crime shows up in most polls and is mentioned a great deal in the presidential race. So let me focus on what I sort of list as, I guess there was maybe three, there's three sort of narrowly focused on law and order, and that is restrict bail, narrow parole, and fund law enforcement. But just thinking about those, let me start with you, Seth. Just thinking about those three, as Greg pointed out, they wouldn't have passed the legislature. Apparently, a group, correct? The group decided that they should. I don't know if it was all one group or there were several, but groups decided that it should be on the ballot. Your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as familiar with the bail one. The other two are both statewide, which is why I'm more familiar with them. They're both of them came from a group called Advanced Colorado, who's a more conservative group, right? They also had 2 other ballot measures. They have 3 other ones. One is the school choice one Greg was referencing. The other 2 were the property tax ones that were yanked down as part of the special session negotiations. Anyway, so but this I think is these exist. These 2. The 2 I'm thinking of, the Department of Corrections one that would extend sentencing, and the law enforcement funding one that would require $350 million more for law enforcement funding. Those exist because they couldn't pass the legislature, right? That this is sort of the value if you're conservative or Republican in the citizens initiative process. The Capitol is nearly supermajority Democrat. The House is, the Senate is 1 away, right? And so you're not going to get any of these through the legislature, right? The House Judiciary Committee in particular is extremely gun shy about, more carceral politics, shall we say, right? That's a very progressive group of legislators. So to twist this, I guess, sort of back into the question of the value of the initiative process, if you're a conservative Republican, this is it. You are out of power in the Capitol. Certainly they have influence, right? But you're out of power in the Capitol. You don't have any of the 4 statewide electeds. So this is a way to, push your politics, push your policies. There's certainly many people in the legislature who feel in particular about the ballot measure that would require $350 million in additional funding for law enforcement, that has ulterior motives, right? That would have a pretty sizable effect on the budget. And Greg can talk about that more for sure. But in talking with legislators, even ones like Shannon Byrd is a representative from Westminster. She's a Democrat, but she's on the more right fringe. No, that's not, I'm sorry. Don't quote me on that. It's more moderate, shall we say. That's much better. More moderate Democrat, particularly when it comes to criminal justice issues. And even she is not crazy about it because she's on the Joint Budget Committee and knows what it would mean. So because Advanced Colorado sort of has a more fiscally conservative mindset, there's this sort of suspicion that this measure isn't just pro law enforcement, it also has some feelings about the budget. Broader point I would try and make is these measures, particularly the 2 from Advance, are evidence of how the citizens initiative process can be used by a group that does not have electoral power, right? That there's no way it's going to get through, even if those were Democratic bills, particularly Republican, because Republicans have no power in the Capitol. So this is the way that they can do it. I mean, it's the same way with the 2 property tax bills that were struck down or pulled down, excuse me. Ken Theory is another great example. We can talk about that forever. So I view these more as signs of where Colorado is politically and the different levers groups pull to still try and find and exercise power. Whether they're going to pass, I don't know. I haven't seen polling on either of them, all 3 of them, if you want to throw the bail one in there too. And there's interesting politics about criminal justice, right? A lot of things have changed since summer 2020. A lot of the positions that the Democratic Party, for instance, took then, a lot of them have backed off of. Does the big police reform bill that passed that summer pass if it were introduced now? I don't know. I don't, Chris is shaking your head. I don't know if it would either. So I think it's a reflection of the politics of the state. And it'll be interesting to watch how much some of those criminal justice policies and beliefs of 4 years ago when there were George Floyd protests and all that, how much that has changed, if at all. That's kind of how I'm thinking about those.
Great. Krista, did you have a thought?
Oh, so I know the people that actually introduced those 2 measures. I consider them friends. After about what I'm about to say now, they may not consider me a friend. I have an issue with both of those, not because I don't think they're well-intentioned, but here's the thing. We have a budget process. And that budget process, legislators have to weigh different things that the state is responsible for. And it isn't just law enforcement. I love law enforcement, but they also have other Justice Department things that they fund, healthcare, education. There are a number of things that have to go through the legislature, and all of those are important. So for a group to, I guess, jump the line, go around that budgeting system to get what they want seems truly unfair to those that went to the table during the process. As for the parole situation, at first blush, this looks like a great idea. Why aren't people serving out their entire sentence? Well, there's reasons for that. So yes, most people who have committed violent offenses do have to serve out the majority of their sentence, but they do at some point go before a parole board, and the parole board looks at what have they been doing in prison? Had they been exercising good behavior? Did they invest in their education? Are they in work programs? These are incentives to help people make the most of their time in prison. Because our goal with prison isn't simply to punish. It's part of that. Part of it is on behalf of the society in which the person went, they've kind of done wrong to us as a society and to the victims. So there is a justice component. So there is a sense of punishment. But on the other side, there's a sense of how do we prepare people to come out of prison and rejoin society? And we've put things in place to ensure that that is possible. Work programs, skills programs, mentoring programs, education programs. And we have incentives for people to go through those programs by saying, you can work off a portion of your sentence by doing that. Secondly, as they go before the parole board is picked by the governor and also by, and then the Senate then affirms those selections. If there is a problem with the parole board, if they are weak on crime, and I don't think Advanced Colorado has put forth any evidence to that effect, If they are weak on crime and they're not doing the job that we have given them, then we hold the governor and the Senate responsible for that. So I would say we already have things in place, and that the people that are putting forth this change in law have not presented evidence that it is not in fact working. I will be voting no on both of those initiatives.
Kevin? you got a
Just
thought?
real briefly, to
Yeah.
follow up on what Chris was saying. This is a really good example of what I spoke about in my opening. We vote on slogans, but we have to implement the details. $350 million out of the state general fund. Same thing applied to the Green Roofs Initiative a few years ago in Denver, completely unable to implement it. We had to rewrite the entire thing. And Floyd, I think you said in the beginning, oh no, I'm sorry, Greg, you said that 57% of the people voted yes on 64 to legalize recreational marijuana,
Right.
when only possibly two out of 100 legislators would have voted on that. Maybe there's reasons for that. I'm not saying that was a good or a bad thing that we did that. What I'm saying is that just because 57 or 60 or 80% of the people say something is good does not mean that they're not voting viscerally. And when I look at these ballot item titles, I see it evokes visceral reaction, especially the Denver ones. Ban slaughterhouses. Who wouldn't want to do that? Except when you go to the Greek restaurant and you want to buy a hero that has lamb in it. The slaughterhouse that's in Denver is a lamb processing center. So we vote on slogans viscerally, but we have to implement the details, which may be in conflict, as Chris has said, with other priorities in the state. Floyd, I think you mentioned in the opening about turnout, and or was it? Maybe it wasn't you, Floyd. Somebody earlier said that ballot issues really seem to drive turnout, and they do. I did an analysis of Denver elections going way back when I was doing my analysis of ranked choice voting, which I very strongly oppose for many reasons, if we talk about later. But I looked at the turnout to vote for Denver mayor in the May elections versus the initiatives or the ballot issues that might be on the ballot. And almost universally, there has never been a mayoral election in Denver where there were more ballots cast for the race for mayor than for one or two of the major initiatives that were on the ballot. People turned out to vote to keep the camping ban, Initiative 300. They turned out on green roofs. They turned out to vote on the issues. And then only incidentally, the undervotes, even for mayor, undervotes for mayor, they just voted on the initiatives and then they leave it blank. So these are the things that people are coming out for.
I think often abortion, for example, guns, other things are put on the ballot to particularly drive turnout. Let me stay with you for Kevin, for just a second. I'm a Denver resident, and I was surprised that the Blue Book only covers Tabor-related measures. Is this new?
Yes.
I've heard other people ask me that. Why?
Yes.
What do you think was
money?
You think it was
dollars?
Budget issue?
The clerk decided. I would not support this, but he's an independent elected official, Paul Lopez. He's a friend of mine. I served with him on the council before he was clerk. I think it was a mistake. But the ballot issues, other than the 4 Tabor issues, the other 7, 8 are published online only. And you would have to go online to denvervotes.org to see those. And I encourage you to do that. We on council had some good government exercises a few years ago. Councilwoman Kendra Black, who's no longer on council, led those discussions with the clerk. And we said we must produce a blue book for Denver local issues, not just the Tabor issues, because people are voting on all these things and we're having to fix them. Let's try to educate them up front. So I'm very, very disappointed that Clerk Lopez chose to not mail the full pro and con and text of the ballot issues, but only the Tabor issues.
If I can jump in here for a second.
Please, I've got a question for you when you're done.
Yeah, of course. So I wanted to make sure that everyone in the room was on the same page. The state blue book is mailed to every household in the state, and that includes the full-scale analyses of all of the 14 state ballot proposals. The history of that goes back well before Tabor. We were producing those sorts of analyses back into at least the 1970s. My office's history as a research institution goes back to the 50s. The Tabor Amendment includes as a constitutional requirement the requirement that for Tabor-related issues or issues that arise under the Tabor elections requirement, that certain information be furnished to voters. And so I think the question from before was, why are only the Tabor measures still being mailed to voters in Denver? The Constitution says they have to be. And so Clerk Lopez can make a decision about whether to constrain the other measures. Clerk Lopez can't make a decision about whether to not print those issues. And that's why those ones are still being sent out. Right. One difference between the state publication and the City of Denver's publication is that ours is written by nonpartisan staff, people like me who are there to attempt to relay what we perceive to be an objective analysis of the measures. It reads as somewhat dry because it's not meant to attempt to convince you to vote one way or the other. I think that in every incarnation of the Denver materials that I've read, the arguments for and against are written by people who are supporting or opposing the measures. And so they read as much stronger language, more emotional language, and in my opinion, less vetted and perhaps in many cases less objective terms.
Thank you. I wrote one of them. a few years ago.
May have been persuasive.
That's true.
The question, Greg, was from a person I think online. Why don't you all publish more about how much money is being spent, who is behind these initiatives, that kind of information? And let me, while you're getting ready to answer that, let me ask you this, because it kind of goes to what you said earlier. Let's say on the election reform initiative, I get lots of questions as to why is there 2 and not 4? Or why did they decide on 4 people to get on the ballot and not 2 as it's used in a number of states? Mm-hmm. Or why go with ranked choice voting? Why not have a runoff, et cetera, et cetera? Are those kinds of questions that you ask? So the first question was, why don't you say more about, you published something about the origin of it and how much money is spent on them? And then my question on reform.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so let's take the first part of that first. There's a couple of reasons why we don't publish information about supporters or opponents of ballot measures. One, and I think probably the most salient answer to this question is almost all of the spending occurs after the Blue Book is published. All of the campaign spending sort of happens in September and October. If you're out trying to convince people to support or oppose ballot measures in July, you're probably not spending your money in all that smart of a place because people aren't going to remember those advertisements when they go to cast their ballots in November. So it's simply a timeline issue. For one thing, we wouldn't be able to say at the beginning of September when we have to send this document to the printer, here's the amount of money that's being spent in each of these campaigns, and have that be at all representative to what's actually occurring by the time election day happens. So one, I think it's impossible. I don't think we could do that. Two, I personally believe, and I think that the sentiment in our office is, we're attempting to give voters the tools to make a decision on the merits of the question. I know that there's a sentiment among probably some of you in the room, maybe some people up here on the panel, that like it ought to matter who's supporting and who's opposing something. For me personally, I like that the ballot puts me in a position to make an informed decision from my own perspective. And there, of course, are resources. Seth is one of them that's going to tell you about, here's all of the spending for and against, here's all of the endorsements, here's everybody if you want that information, it's out there. We're a nonpartisan agency. We're attempting to give voters the tools to make a decision on their own. And if what they want to do is go look up the work that Seth's doing and the other excellent journalists in our state are doing to figure that out for themselves, of course, they can and should do that. On the second question about whether we ask substantive questions of proponents when they bring ballot measures, yes, we absolutely do. But note that they're not accountable to us, right? Like, we will put on the record this question. This is a publicly broadcast hearing. The room is open to the public. There is never an audience there, but if anyone would like to come down and listen to the review and comment hearings, you are certainly welcome to. We would love to have some company. But the proponents don't have any obligation to satisfy our questions, right? Like, we can say, hey, this looks badly written and unimplementable, and they can say, great, we'll take it on. I mean, it is not our job to make them change their measures. We don't have any authority in that space, but it is our job to point out where we think something may be confusing or the timelines may not work. Something we think about all the time is you want this certain thing to happen in July, but the information to produce it doesn't happen until August. And those are the kinds of like really sticky details that somebody who's motivated by effectuating a policy outcome may not necessarily be thinking about because they weren't working with an expert drafter necessarily. They may have just written this themselves. A lot of the submissions that we get, and these ones don't come anywhere near the ballot, are just somebody writes an email that says, I think the speed limit on state highways should be no lower than 85 miles an hour. And we're like, okay, but that's not a proposal, right? And we do all of those meetings too. So seriously, come down, listen, it's great.
Kevin, a question on, or something on that?
Quickly, I'm glad to hear you say that because in Denver, it's very similar. That we have a review and comment period when initiators come in and present to the city attorney and to our legislative staff. And I was very, very disappointed in how that works. We can only suggest, but we cannot compel a change in their language. So we ended up recently with the Denver's new sidewalk fee, which was completely unworkable and completely inequitable. And I attended that review and comment session, and I wasn't even allowed to ask a question. Only the attorney and the legislative staffer who actually works for me could ask the questions, and they had to be submitted 2 days ahead of time, and they were provided to the citizen initiators. So it was like looking at a Broadway play audition where they were reading from the script. Very, very disappointing that we can't weed out not bad ideas. If they wanted to pass the sidewalk fee, great. Can you work with us to see how we could make it actually work so that we didn't have to spend the last year and a half on a task force to try to fix it?
Seth.
Yeah, just to two quick things. One on both questions for Greg. I am personally a believer that in understanding who is paying for what is happening. But I agree with Greg that I don't necessarily think that's a job for the Blue Book. One, yeah, there's us, there's journalists. It's a big part of what we should be doing, right? And you all and people listening, you can look it up yourself as well. Tracer is the state's campaign finance database. It's kind of a giant pain in the ass, but once you figure it out, it's helpful. The other difficult, just thinking like practically, if you were to put in the Blue Book who is funding some of these measures, some of them, Prop 131, the ballot initiative one, or the election process we keep all referencing, has relatively few donors. Some have a lot. So if you were to do it that way, do you pick the top three? Do you pick just the proponent organization that backed it, like Advanced Colorado for those ones we talked about, or Ken Theory and Unite America for Prop 131? So I think people should understand why something is on their ballot, both in terms of sort of like the broader political questions, but also who's literally put it there. It costs a lot of money to get something on the ballot. So I think you should understand that, but the Blue Book is already so long. Someone held it up in the back. It's a tome, right? So it's thick, and there's a plug for us. There's a lot of political journalists in Colorado. We work very hard, and a lot of us pay a lot of attention to the money. So the info is out there, and you can find it yourself. And I very much encourage you to. I think that's an important part of understanding why you're being asked the questions you're asked on the ballot. And I had another point, but I spaced it. Forgive me, it's been a long day, so I'm just going to shut up and move on.
I agree, at least from my point of view, because I'm interested in the politics of these things. There are articles on how much is being spent, often millions, some of it coming in late, where it's coming from, typically some particular donors. Sometimes they're hidden because they're using a device that doesn't report it. But nonetheless, all that is sort of factored into who's behind it, what kind of chances it has, does it have any opposition? I mean, that's certainly one of the questions, is that many of these things, the level of support from donors is pretty one-sided. But I wanted to ask Seth something he referenced, and that is, and I also got a question from somebody about the property tax machinations that took place in the legislature last year, and consequently producing that we don't have some ballot initiatives this year. Kind of describe that. That is, say, the idea that initiatives are used for negotiation, this same group used these initiatives for negotiation to get an agreement from the governor and the legislative leadership on what they would want to do, which is to lower taxes. And hence, that entire process was sort of offline, and what was produced never got to the legislature or to the voters.
Correct. Yeah, and it goes back. If you'll will bear with me for 2 seconds. So there was a lot more attention paid to the property tax sort of negotiations in August, right? But if you go back to May, there was an oil and gas deal that was struck between folks who wanted tighter limitations on oil and gas in the oil and gas industry, because the oil and gas industry had some ballot measures. So the governor's office sort of acted as the negotiator and made this grand bargain. A couple of bills were passed, a couple of others weren't. The ballot measures didn't go through. Same thing with medical malpractice caps. There was the Trial Lawyers Association were planning to run a ballot measure that would have eliminated the cap on medical malpractice. The sky would have been the limit. The insurance industry had a couple of ballot measures they were running in opposition, one of which would have capped attorneys' fees. So the CTLA did not love that. As the son of a trial lawyer, they don't like that idea. So, but in both cases, the governor's office sort of brought these groups together, and then they had their negotiations, bills were passed, and then there's nothing on y'all's ballot about med-mal, right, or attorney's fees. So the trend has sort of been building, which brings us to the property tax deal. God, I have talked so much about property taxes over the last year. So the legislature, just very quickly, the legislature passed a property tax bill in the spring. That did not bring down these two much more sort of stark ballot measures, property tax ballot measures that would have been on y'all's ballot. Greg could probably talk more about the policy than I can in detail. Sure. Please don't make me. It's again a long day. But the sense in the spring, things changed quickly. But the sense in the spring from the legislature and even some of the proponents of it was, okay, we're good on property taxes. Hopefully these will either go away or they'll fail. That changed as the summer went on. Negotiations sort of started back up again quietly. I started to hear about them at the end of July. And the fear from the governor's office and from some legislators is if we leave this to the ballot and these are passed, they would have such catastrophic effects on the budget that it's not prudent for us, being the legislature, to take that risk. One Democrat said to me, what if we could go back and negotiate Tabor? And Tabor wasn't on the ballot, and we found some way to do it legislatively and not have that. Obviously, Democrats don't like Tabor, but which, you know, it speaks to how they were thinking about this, right? Democrats in the legislature in particular struggle against Tabor all the time. So this sort of sense of, okay, if these pass, we're going to face difficult decisions, budget, both at a state level for backfill and the local level where those property tax cuts would have been felt. So a lot of people were not happy. A lot of legislators were not happy, even those who voted for it, because they felt like they had sort of been usurped, right? The governor struck this deal with the help of a couple legislators with a private group. It was backed by very wealthy interests, and the legislature was sort of expected to come in and rubber stamp this deal. So there was a lot of griping. The deal got done. That's it, hopefully, like fingers crossed on property taxes for a few years. I think the deal was 3 assessment cycles, looking down. Yeah, so for at least 6 years, theoretically, we will be done talking about property taxes in the way we have been. I don't think that's true. I think we're probably gonna be talking about property tax policy in January when the legislature is back. But at least in this way, these sort of what we, at least in the press corps, have referred to as the property tax wars, hopefully will go down. The broader question about these negotiations, you know, there's, I guess, like 2 schools of thoughts. The one I just sort of laid out of the property taxes. What if we could just have these negotiations, solve it that way, and we didn't have to risk the voters taking a more drastic decision? There's wisdom there. Then the other wisdom is, why don't you trust the voters? There were a lot of progressives who would talk to me about the property tax bills. We trust the voters. If we got out there and say, if you do this, then you will lose all this money on local services. Yeah, you might save property taxes to this effect. Why don't we trust voters and do that? So that's the sort of other school of thought. And where is right, as a good journalist, I will not tell you, you just decide. But I think finally, the last thing I'll say, and I'll shut up. I think the Governor Pollster in particular, is an important piece to understand here. He has politics, but they're very difficult to pin down in a single word, right? A lot of people say he's a libertarian. He has some libertarian-esqueness, right? He's obviously a Democrat by title, but he is into this kind of thing, right? Being the negotiator, being able to say you cut people's taxes while not cratering the budget. So this governor is an important sort of dynamic because of his own just political disposition, his personal disposition in dealing with different groups. That I think is why in particular the last year you've seen more negotiations like this because of who the governor is, who his staff is, and the competing interests he's balancing, sort of the more progressive folks, and then the ocean to, that's not on that wing.
Chris, comment on negotiations kind of it being one of the motivations for ballot initiatives and what happened on property taxes?
I guess it shows the difference between a journalist and a columnist. I can give my opinion. It looks a little like extortion to me. And yeah, it's brilliant politics, but it's not good lawmaking.
Bingo.
That was the word extortion. We heard the word extortion a lot during the session. Hostage taking.
Yeah, there was. Although that is an interesting thought that the left thought we ought to just take the risk. Let's not give in to this negotiation. Let's take the risk. We believe we can defeat it. The governor didn't want to do that. Frankly, I think on balance, and he might have had polling on it. He knows the resources that might have been put behind it. I think on balance, he was being more cautious. Yes, Kevin.
Just quickly, that's how in Denver, that's how we got the sales taxes for climate action and for parks in Denver, because there were outside advocacy groups that were going to put initiatives on the ballot. And some of the council members proactively worked with them to construct something that we could refer to the ballot that would be implementable. Thank you.
Two other quick things. So what Floyd just said about the left, again, you sort of have to think of the governor as a important piece of this. A lot of progressive legislators butt heads with the governor frequently. And so part of the frustration with this negotiation over property taxes is there was a sense, whether right or wrong, again, I'm not going to say, but there was a sense from that sort of flank that the governor is more willing to listen to the Advanced Colorado's, Governor Bill Owens was another backer, than he is, labor unions or progressive groups, housing groups. So that part of why there was so much sort of consternation was a buildup of drama, rather than there was certainly some specific to this issue of property taxes, but some of it was also just bubbling frustration that this class of legislators in particular, who've been in for 2 years now, have just slowly been building toward.
Greg, one question we got, and that is what's your comfort level and the staff's comfort level that people actually can understand, as hard as you try to produce a blue book that gives the both sides and gives a good description of it. Do you get feedback that people understand it, or what's the usage level, that type of thing? Is this a good approach? We obviously depend upon it a great deal, both your initial discovery process and the question process, and then of course what you write ultimately.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that we wrestle with all the time. I think that the goal is to produce a product that is accessible to everyone who might want to read it. We constantly look for ways to make the language easier to grasp, make the concepts explained in shorter sentences and shorter paragraphs and with more visualizations and things like that. I think we got a little bit lucky with the content of the measures this year. There are 14 measures. I would say of those 14, there are 2 that are actually complicated. Of course, the elections measure. I'd also say the parole eligibility measure, just because it requires a lot of background about how parole eligibility works. That's not a really intuitive thing. It's actually quite mathy. Beyond those 2 measures, the other 12 that are on the ballot this year are pretty straightforward measures. Now, had we been doing 50 and 108, had you seen the property tax language that we had produced, right? We had written full form blue books for those 2 measures, and we're ready to include them in the blue book. Those write-ups were very, very difficult, I think, for any reader to grasp. And that's despite our best efforts. It's just because it requires a very sophisticated understanding of how property taxes work. And it's interesting because neither of those measures are very long. Initiative 50 takes up about 1/3 of a page. Initiative 108 took up a couple pages of text. But it's an immensely complicated piece of policy. And then the legislature, Seth alluded to this, passed a bill during the 2024 session that would have changed how those measures are implemented or changed how itself was implemented in response to those measures taking effect. And that just, there were layers on layers of policy in addition to the policy itself being extremely complicated. So we have to hold ourselves to a standard of ease of reading. Sometimes the policy just doesn't lend itself to easy reading. And in those cases, it's frustrating for us because we have a constitutional requirement to communicate this to voters. We can't simply say, well, this initiative's too complicated, so we're not going to tell you about it. We do get feedback on the Blue Book. So we get feedback in a couple different places. One is the preliminary drafts that we circulate for public comment. The commentary on those tends to come from either proponents of or opponents to measures. And they will often say, well, you should write way more stuff saying that this measure is a bad idea and take out all the stuff that says this measure is a good idea. It's like, great, okay, well, we're not going to do that. And then there are a few folks who have taken it upon themselves to be sort of reviewers for us in the community. We don't coordinate with them other than sending these drafts out to big listservs that they've subscribed to. And they write back and say, hey, this paragraph I thought could have been cleaner. And we're like, great, that's helpful to know. Once we publish the Blue Book, overwhelmingly the feedback we get is, we love the Blue Book. Thank you for doing this. It's so great. I moved here from wherever and they didn't have that there. And I really feel empowered as a voter. And that makes our day, right? Like that is indicative that the work that we do matters. And then we get some people who are upset about whatever measure and say, how could we not have mentioned that this was an introduction to fascism or whatever? And
I think you do a
don't
great
write
job.
back. Thanks.
The Blue Book is great. Blue Book is great.
It's part of our system. And speaking of our system, we talked about how we might change it. If we are concerned about the volume and the complexity, we could potentially, as you know, a couple of years ago we did. As I recall, Greg, we made it more difficult to get on the ballot. I don't know if we constitutional amendments were changed to get your signatures had to come out of state Senate seats, and then they raised the threshold, or I mean the passage.
So they didn't actually make it more difficult to get on the ballot. They made it more difficult to put something in the Constitution. It used to be exactly the same. So the threshold to put something in statute and the threshold to put something in the Constitution were exactly the same threshold, which meant that any savvy proponent would say, well, I'm just going to put this in the Constitution, so the legislative body can't come in and mess around with what I wanted later. So yeah, you have to have 55% of the votes to pass. You have to collect signatures in every state Senate district as opposed to statewide. But otherwise, it's, I mean, like I said, we've got 14 measures now. We had 13 measures in 2018. They're going to keep coming, right?
Isn't the percentage we use of like a previous vote for Secretary of State or something, yes, rather low compared to other states?
Yes.
And secondly, have you all thought about, and I know there are some other approaches to reviews, for example, doesn't one state sort of have the legislature sort of pro forma go through the process of reviewing the legislation, having hearings, and then I don't think they particularly vote, but maybe they do. But in any event, that it can be ignored, but they make it go through an actual legislative process. Because as you point out, your process is pretty behind the scenes, and that would be a more public process. I'm just trying to think about, have we looked at, if there are some complaints, some other alternatives?
So those would require constitutional amendments. So they themselves, we would need ballot measures to change ballot measures, which is something we've done in the past. You're referring back to an instance where that's something that the legislature did take on, or private citizens who were themselves legislators did take on. Yeah, we could make those changes. I haven't heard of a serious movement for that. Okay. The one that I would really like to see is just a requirement that the person who's actually writing the measure have experience in having done legislative drafting. So setting aside sort of the implementation questions that Councilman Flynn has brought up over the course of our panel discussion this evening, I would just like it to be the case that I can read a measure and know what it does. So there's one example. I didn't talk earlier about the law enforcement recruitment and training funding measure. That measure says it requires the appropriation of $350 million for law enforcement recruitment and training. But it doesn't say when it requires the appropriation of $350 million. Appropriations are all written for specific fiscal years. And so it doesn't say spend $350 million next fiscal year. It doesn't say spend, $35 million over the next $35 million over each of the next 10 years, or $350 million over each of the next 10 years. There's just we don't know what it means or says because it itself is unclear. And when we're writing a Blue Book analysis of that measure, we both want to be respectful of what the proponent's intent was, while also being respectful to voters in not representing to them that the measure does maybe what the proponents meant for it to do, but not what it says in its plain language, because once it becomes the law, what the proponents intended matters very, very little. It matters a little bit. Courts will look at it as interpretive guidance, but not when there's plain text reading of the measure that suggests otherwise. So in that case, it says $350 million over, we don't know what time horizon, and we're not able to give that guidance. So that's actually a reform that I think you could accomplish in statute without needing to amend the Constitution. To say, well, there needs to be a legislative, what Councilman Flynn was asking for, which is the ability to workshop this, that would require an initiative before you all to amend the Constitution to change the initiative process that we have in Colorado.
I used to be strongly in favor of maybe raising that number of signatures required, but in California, it's quite high, and you simply pay more money. In other words, the people that are involved with it have to invest more money in it. And typically, many of these people can invest more money in it. They simply have it available. Krista, you in one of your articles, you referred to sort of regulatory biology or the reference. And as you know, we have on Lions, we have veterinary associates. What's your thought on that?
So I did 3 columns. One was on ballot box biology.
Right, that was
then ballot box business regulation, and also ballot box budgeting. And it all kind of goes to my critique that I think these things should be done in a way that is full of public input, compromising between Democrats and Republicans, done through formal systems that again require people to do diligence. And in this case, we've got a ballot measure on hunting of mountain lions, for example. Well, one of the ways that wildlife is managed in this state, actually around the country, is that they use hunters. Hunters pay for permits. They do the hunting basically on behalf of the state. It's controlled. The biologists come in and say, we need this number of deer, elk, mountain lions, trout, whatever it is. And the public, as hunters and fishermen and fisherwomen, go in, they buy a permit, and they do this on behalf of Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Without hunters doing it, Colorado Parks and Wildlife will have to hire people to do it. And so coming in and circumventing the scientists, and I think for that column, or at least one of the columns in the last couple of years, I actually looked up how many biologists are, what does their executive team look like over at the Colorado Parks and Wildlife. There are a lot of people with masters and PhDs in biology and other related sciences. Also, the board that overlooks that particular department has different kinds of people by mandate. So there is representation of the Western Slope, people who would be most impacted by this. And so again, in the beginning, I talked about protections for minority populations. Most of the population of the state is in the urban corridor, and yet we are dictating policy through direct democracy for other parts of the state that simply don't have the numbers. They are a minority compared to the majority. So asking the voter to do ballot box biology is wrong in and of itself, but also depriving minorities of representation, which they do have with the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but not necessarily in an election. Then there's another ballot initiative, and that's ballot box budgeting. There's a couple in there that I critiqued, including the funding for officers. And finally, ballot box business regulation. The legislature, we pay them like $46,000 a year, each lawmaker. What is it? It's about that?
It's about that.
Yeah.
All right, we pay them to do this job, and yet now we are asking voters to look at occupational licensing with regard to veterinarians and veterinary, this sort of new veterinarian associate position. What I think is wrong there is that it was looked at in the legislature. A compromise was made between those that want this and those that don't want this. Mainly the veterinarians don't want this. The people who have animal rescue facilities, Humane Society and Dumb Friends League, they do want this change in licensure. There was a compromise made, and then you have a group saying, I don't like that compromise, essentially going around it and going directly to the voter, asking the voter to then vote on business licensure or a position licensure for this particular veterinary position. We pay legislators to do this, and a compromise was already made. If that compromise is not workable, take it back to the legislature. Don't simply say, I don't like what happened there, therefore I'm going to go directly to the voter. Voters should not be making these decisions. We pick representatives and we pay those representatives. Let's make them do their job.
Is there a way, Greg, to get more information on what does school choice mean, or it has to be litigated if it's passed? It's not clear what that is going to produce.
So I think it's pretty clear that it has to be litigated, but I will offer this for proponents of that measure and proponents of the abortion right measure. I think that the idea of codifying a right in the Constitution is something that has a long lineage in our country. If you read the First Amendment to the US Constitution and see rights to freedom of speech and of the press and of assembly and of religion, you don't know what that means on its own. The Constitution doesn't provide specifics on that front. When you see the right to a jury of one's peers, even that, which has some more specificity, still has hundreds or thousands of pages of federal case law providing interpretive guidance. I think in the case of both the school choice measure and the abortion measure, the premise is these are things that Coloradans are currently afforded, but are not now constitutionally identified. And for proponents of both of those measures, the idea is to constitutionalize those rights so that they cannot be taken away by future legislative decisions. And so that's what the measures do. They say, they ask the question to voters, ought this right to exist in the Constitution? The school choice measure is exactly that. It just creates a right. The abortion measure, I just should note for clarity, also repeals a section of the Constitution that says there can't be public funding for abortion. And so that one does actually entail a policy change, whereas the school choice measure is simply saying this is a right that we, the proponents, and we hope the voters agree ought to be included here. And that's the question that's being put to you all when you cast your ballots on that measure.
Kevin, you sit on an important board that decides about what goes on the ballot. Is there much resistance? Because what you hear a lot from your fellow council people is, I don't know if I'm in favor of this, but let's let the voters decide. And as we kind of discussed here, specifically Seth talking about the tax initiative, that really is, if that's going to be your criteria, then it's probably going to pass if it's popular and beneficial to them in terms of their own self-interest, but maybe not good for the city, or maybe not good for the budget, or maybe unworkable. And so it felt like that's supposed to be sort of a wall, or at least a border that it has to get through, and it's tough. And it doesn't sound as tough as it might, I don't know, in terms of those 12 initiatives, at least some of them, or some of the ones that you all passed.
I think the landscape here might look a lot different if we had released that Oregon wolf pack in Cherry Creek. It's real easy to fall back on let the voters decide. I have my own opinion, but let the voters decide. And I kind of want to reach out and go, that's why you were elected, though,
Yeah.
To get to Krista's point. For instance, Denver City Council has drafted, our attorneys have drafted a proclamation for the council to, this is off the record.
Yes, off the record.
In opposition to the slaughterhouse ban. would throw out of work 160 mostly
Right.
Latino workers in an employee-owned company. The majority of the council has already agreed to vote yes on this. A slim seven of the 13. We have 7 people who would vote yes on it. We have other members who oppose the measure, but they don't believe, as you said, they don't believe it's our job to tell people how the council feels about this as a body. But we've done it before.
Yeah.
We did it in, was it 21 or 22, when the Denver Republican Party put 2
Right.
initiatives on the ballot.
Yep.
One of which would have changed how we enforce the camping ban, and it would have created a right of action by a citizen who would file a complaint about an encampment, and if we didn't clean it up in 3 days, they could file an action against the city. And the other one would have reduced the city's general sales tax to less than what it currently is. It would have impacted our general fund budget. And former Councilwoman Robin Keach led the council to a unanimous vote on 2 proclamations, one that opposed 303 and the other opposed 304. That was the number of those 2.
Right.
So I think it is our job to weigh in. That's why we're elected. I hate to say this because it's very self-serving, but people look up to us. Say, that's why we elected you. You can tell me what's going on down there, and I trust you to make the right decision. And if you didn't make the right decision, then I'll vote against you in the next election. It should be that simple, but it isn't. It's frustrating to me to know that a majority of us every Monday night, a majority of us opposes the slaughterhouse ban and probably the fur ban as well. But we're not willing to say that.
We want to thank the panel. As you can see, the reason why there's so much interest in these ballot initiatives is there's a lot of different philosophical positions. There's a lot of politics and a lot of process involved. Some serious people working on it. So thank you very much for joining us. And thank CU Denver, the Public Affairs School, for putting this on and sponsored it, and the food and back. I think there may still be some, and I know there were some additional questions. I think poor Greg got several of them. A lady asked, the League of Women Voters has a guide. Do you ever reference that kind of information?
We read it.
There you go. Question answered. But in any event, they'll be here for a moment or two, and thank all of you for joining us.